August 1610. The stone corridors of Countess castle echo with screams that will haunt these walls for centuries. In a chamber deep within this Hungarian fortress, a woman of 50 years kneels beside a wooden tub filled with steaming crimson liquid. Her pale hands, adorned with rings bearing the noble crest of Bathory, dip into the warm blood as she bathes her face and neck with methodical precision. The lifeless body of a young peasant girl lies nearby, her throat slashed, her blood still draining into vessels prepared for this grotesque ritual. This woman, who once held dominion over vast estates and commanded the respect of European nobility, believes she has discovered the secret to eternal youth. Her name is Elizabeth Bathory, and within months, she will be accused of murdering over 600 young women in pursuit of preserving her fading beauty. But the bloodbath, if it ever truly happened, represents only the surface of a story that cuts far deeper into the diseased heart of aristocratic power run utterly mad. Elizabeth Bathory was not some wild-eyed peasant dabbling in folk magic. She was one of the most educated and influential women of her time, related to kings, married to a war hero, fluent in multiple languages, and commanding wealth that rivaled royal treasuries. She possessed everything the 16th century could offer a woman of noble birth: power, education, independence, and vast estates stretching across Hungary and Slovakia. Yet by 1610, when Hungarian authorities finally breached the walls of Countess castle, they claimed to find evidence of systematic torture and murder spanning decades. Witnesses would testify to seeing girls suspended from ceilings, their bodies pierced with needles and knives. Servants spoke of chambers designed specifically for inflicting pain, of young women lured to the castle with promises of employment only to disappear forever. The investigators documented implements of torture, iron pincers, branding tools, and devices whose sole purpose was the methodical infliction of agony. What transforms this from a simple tale of noble cruelty into something far more disturbing is the calculated nature of the alleged crimes. This was not random violence born of momentary rage, but rather a systematic campaign of torture and murder that authorities claimed had been refined and perfected over 20 years. Elizabeth allegedly developed increasingly sophisticated methods of causing pain, recruited accomplices to help her procure victims, and created an entire apparatus dedicated to satisfying her need for young blood. The medical reality of what these victims endured defies comprehension. In an age without anesthesia or modern understanding of shock, the girls who entered Bathory's chambers would have experienced every moment of their torture with devastating clarity. The human body can remain conscious for minutes during blood loss, meaning victims likely witnessed their own murders, while Elizabeth collected their blood for her macabre beauty treatments. But here lies the mystery that has puzzled historians for 4 centuries. Was Elizabeth Bathory truly the blood-drinking monster of legend? Or was she the victim of a carefully orchestrated political conspiracy designed to seize her vast wealth and eliminate a powerful woman who had accumulated too much independence? The evidence against her, while extensive, comes primarily from testimonies extracted under torture from her own servants. No physical evidence of her alleged bloodbaths has ever been discovered, despite detailed inventories of her possessions. What we know with certainty is that Elizabeth Bathory died imprisoned in her own castle, her reputation destroyed, her wealth confiscated, and her name forever associated with one of history's most horrific legends of aristocratic evil. In the royal chambers of Countess castle, servants would discover scenes that defied comprehension. Young peasant girls, barely past childhood, found dead in corridors with wounds covering their bodies. Others discovered alive but bearing marks of systematic torture, burns, cuts, bite marks that formed grotesque patterns across their flesh. The woman responsible for this carnage was not some deranged commoner, but Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most powerful noblewomen in 16th century Hungary. Born into aristocracy, married to a war hero, mother to 4 children, and quite possibly the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history. Elizabeth Bathory entered the world in 1560 as Hungarian nobility, her family among the most influential in the kingdom. The Bathorys had produced kings, cardinals, and military commanders who shaped Central European politics for generations. Elizabeth's upbringing reflected this status. She received education in languages, literature, and the arts that few women of her era could access. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman known as the Black Knight for his ruthless military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Their union created one of the most powerful political alliances in Hungary, controlling vast territories and commanding armies. For decades, Elizabeth appeared to fulfill her role as expected. She managed the family's extensive estates while her husband waged war, demonstrated remarkable administrative skills, and bore 4 children who secured the Nadasdy lineage. Contemporary accounts describe a woman of exceptional beauty and intelligence, fluent in Hungarian, Latin, and German, who corresponded with scholars and maintained one of the region's most sophisticated courts. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth assumed control of the family's holdings, a position that granted her almost absolute authority over thousands of peasants and servants. But beneath this facade of aristocratic respectability, something far more sinister was taking root. Servants began disappearing from Elizabeth's households with disturbing regularity. Young girls recruited from peasant families to work in her castles would simply vanish, their families told they had run away or died of illness. Those who remained alive whispered of midnight screams echoing through castle corridors, of torture devices kept in Elizabeth's private chambers, of rooms stained with blood that servants were forbidden to clean. The scope of Elizabeth's crimes gradually expanded beyond her immediate household. She established what she called a school for young noblewomen, ostensibly to teach them proper etiquette and courtly behavior. In reality, this institution became a hunting ground where she could access victims from higher social classes, girls whose disappearances might normally provoke investigation, but who were isolated and vulnerable within her domain. What distinguished Elizabeth from other nobility who abused their power was the systematic, ritualistic nature of her violence. This was not random cruelty or momentary rage, but carefully planned torture that she appeared to derive genuine pleasure from inflicting. Witnesses who later testified described her laughter during these sessions, her meticulous attention to prolonging suffering, her apparent sexual arousal from the pain she caused. The medical reality of what these young women endured defies comfortable description. Without anesthesia or medical intervention, victims experienced prolonged torture sessions that could last for hours. Burns from heated metal objects, systematic cutting with knives and razors, starvation and exposure to freezing temperatures during Hungarian winters. Some were kept alive for weeks, their wounds allowed to fester and heal, only to be reopened again. By 1610, Elizabeth Bathory had transformed from a respected aristocrat into something approaching a medieval nightmare made flesh. The woman who had once corresponded with scholars and managed vast estates had become a predator who viewed human beings as objects for her entertainment. Her victims numbered in the hundreds, their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves throughout her territories. By 1609, whispers about Elizabeth Bathory had grown too loud to ignore. For years, stories had circulated through the villages surrounding her castles. Stories of girls who entered her service and were never seen again. Parents searching for missing daughters. Servants who spoke in hushed tones of screams echoing through castle corridors at night. But Elizabeth was a widow of immense wealth and political influence, protected by her noble blood and extensive properties. Who would dare accuse a countess of such monstrous crimes? The answer came from an unexpected source. A Lutheran minister named István Magyari. In 1610, Magyari wrote a letter to the authorities detailing horrific allegations against the Countess. According to his accounts, Elizabeth had tortured and murdered hundreds of young girls, primarily peasant daughters who came to work in her households. The letter described scenes of unimaginable cruelty. Girls beaten with clubs, burned with hot irons, and subjected to tortures so elaborate they seemed to emerge from the darkest corners of human imagination. What made Magyary's accusations particularly damaging was their specificity. He didn't speak in vague terms about mysterious disappearances. Instead, he provided detailed testimony from witnesses, servants who had seen the aftermath of Elizabeth's rage, villagers who had delivered girls to the castle only to have them vanish, and even former accomplices who had finally broken their silence. The minister claimed that over 600 young women had perished at the hands of the Countess and her servants. King Matthias II of Hungary faced a delicate political situation. Elizabeth Bathory was not merely any noblewoman, she was one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the kingdom. Her late husband had been a war hero, and her family connections extended throughout the highest levels of European aristocracy. Moreover, the crown owed the Bathory family enormous sums of money, debts that would conveniently disappear if Elizabeth were convicted of capital crimes. But the accusations were too serious and too public to ignore. In late 1610, the king ordered György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary and a family friend of the Báthorys, to investigate the allegations. Thurzó was instructed to proceed with extreme caution. If the charges proved true, he was to arrest Elizabeth immediately. If they proved false, the matter would be quietly buried. On the night of December 30th, 1610, Thurzó and his men approached Bathe Castle. According to the official reports filed later, what they discovered inside fulfilled their worst fears. The investigators claimed to find the recently tortured body of one girl, along with several others who were dying from their injuries. Witnesses later testified that they had seen additional bodies throughout the castle, bearing signs of systematic torture and abuse. Elizabeth was arrested on the spot. Her 4 primary accomplices, Dorothea Szentes, Ilona Jo, Katarina Benica, and János Újvári, were also taken into custody. The Countess, then 50 years old, reportedly showed no emotion as she was placed under house arrest within her own castle walls. She neither confessed nor denied the charges, maintaining a silence that would continue throughout the investigation. The formal charges were staggering in their scope. Elizabeth was accused of the systematic torture and murder of young girls over a period of decades. The prosecution would claim that she had developed increasingly elaborate methods of inflicting pain, driven by a pathological need to maintain her youth and beauty through the suffering of others. As word of her arrest spread throughout Hungary, the woman who had once been celebrated as a powerful widow and patron of the arts became known by a different name, the Blood Countess. The stories that emerged from those castle walls were so horrific they would echo through 4 centuries. According to testimonies gathered during the investigation, Elizabeth didn't simply kill her victims. She transformed their deaths into elaborate rituals of vanity and madness. Witnesses claimed she would have young girls stripped naked and suspended from the ceiling of her torture chamber, their bodies pierced with needles and blades until blood flowed freely below. But it was what Elizabeth allegedly did next that elevated her from mere murderer to something far more disturbing. She bathed in their blood. The legend claims Elizabeth believed that virgin blood possessed magical properties, that it could preserve her youth and beauty indefinitely. Servants testified they had seen her emerge from copper tubs filled with the crimson liquid, her pale skin glistening as she performed what she apparently considered essential beauty treatments. Some accounts describe her drinking the blood directly from her victims, convinced that consuming their youth would transfer to her own body. Others spoke of seeing her face and hands smeared with blood as she stood before mirrors, applying it like cosmetic cream to her aging features. The medical reality of what Elizabeth was doing to herself is deeply disturbing. Human blood, when applied to skin, would have caused severe irritation, potential infections, and certainly wouldn't have provided any anti-aging benefits. If she was indeed consuming blood regularly, the iron content alone would have gradually poisoned her system, causing organ damage and potentially affecting her mental state even further. The bacterial contamination from decomposing blood would have created a constant risk of sepsis, a condition that could explain some of the erratic behavior witnesses described. But perhaps most chilling was the systematic nature these rituals allegedly took. This wasn't random violence born of sudden rage. According to depositions, Elizabeth had specific preferences for her victims. Young virgins, preferably from noble families, whose blood she believed held greater power. She supposedly maintained detailed records of her kills, treating murder like a scientific experiment in the pursuit of eternal beauty. The torture chambers at Countess castle were said to contain specialized equipment: iron maidens lined with spikes, heated pokers, and collection vessels specifically designed to gather blood without waste. What transformed Elizabeth from a woman obsessed with her appearance into someone who would commit such atrocities? Court records suggest she genuinely believed in the efficacy of her blood baths. In an era when medical knowledge was primitive and superstitions about blood magic were widespread, Elizabeth may have convinced herself that she had discovered the secret to immortality. Witnesses described her studying her reflection obsessively after each ritual, searching for signs that her grotesque treatments were working. The psychological deterioration this represents is staggering. Elizabeth had created an entire belief system around her murders, transforming what should have been moments of horror into ceremonies she viewed as necessary self-care. She had convinced herself that the screams of dying girls were simply the price of beauty, that their terror and agony were justified by her desire to remain young. Yet even as these testimonies were recorded, questions lingered about their reliability. Medieval justice often relied on coerced confessions and fantastical accusations. The blood-bathing legends were so extreme they seemed almost designed to shock, perfect ammunition for political enemies seeking to destroy the Bathory name. But whether these rituals happened exactly as described or were embellished by terrified servants and ambitious prosecutors, they revealed something deeply disturbing about the woman who had once been one of Hungary's most powerful nobles. The trial that began in 1611 would expose horrors that even hardened judges struggled to comprehend. Elizabeth Bathory, protected by her noble blood from public execution, would never face her accusers directly. Instead, she remained confined to her castle while her accomplices were dragged before the court to testify about acts so depraved that chroniclers hesitated to record them in full detail. Dorothea Sentis, known as Dorko, was the first to break under interrogation. This woman, who had served the Countess for years, described scenes of systematic torture with chilling precision. She spoke of heated coins pressed into the palms of servant girls, of needles driven under fingernails, of bodies beaten until the walls were splattered with blood. Her testimony revealed not random acts of cruelty, but a methodical campaign of violence that had consumed the castle for over a decade. Ilona Jo and Katarina Benica followed, their confessions painting an even darker picture. They described how Elizabeth would select her victims from among the prettiest servant girls, how she would fly into rages that lasted for hours, how the screams from the upper chambers had become so commonplace that the remaining staff learned to ignore them entirely. The judges listened in horrified silence as witness after witness corroborated the same impossible details. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of János Újvári, Elizabeth's castellan, who had kept meticulous records. He spoke of bodies removed under cover of darkness, of graves dug in secret, of a registry that documented the deaths of 650 young women. The courtroom fell silent when this number was read aloud, a figure so staggering that it challenged belief, yet supported by physical evidence and multiple testimonies. The court also heard from survivors, girls who had escaped the castle's chambers with permanent injuries and psychological scars. Their accounts were consistent in their horror. Elizabeth Bathory had transformed her ancestral home into a factory of suffering, where human life held no more value than livestock. These witnesses described not just physical torture, but psychological torment, how the Countess seemed to derive pleasure from their terror, how she would prolong their agony for days or even weeks. Throughout the proceedings, Elizabeth's noble status created a legal paradox. Hungarian law protected aristocrats from capital punishment, yet the evidence against her was overwhelming. The judges found themselves confronting not just individual crimes, but what appeared to be the systematic extermination of an entire generation of young women from the surrounding villages. The verdicts, when they came, reflected both the gravity of the crimes and the constraints of medieval justice. Dorothea Zentes and Ilona Jo were sentenced to have their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive, a punishment that matched the brutality they had helped inflict. Katarina Benica, deemed less culpable due to her youth, was sentenced to life imprisonment. János Újvári was beheaded, his complicity in the cover-up earning him a swift but final justice. For Elizabeth herself, the court reached a compromise between justice and law. She would be immured, sealed alive within the walls of her own castle, with only small openings for food and air. It was a sentence that ensured she would never again harm another soul while preserving the technical letter of noble privilege. The trial's conclusion left an entire region grappling with an impossible question. How had such systematic evil flourished for so long under the protection of noble birth? The evidence had revealed not just individual cruelty, but the complete corruption of feudal power, where absolute authority had transformed a protector into a predator of her own people. The severed head of Elizabeth Bathory never adorned London Bridge. No crowd gathered to witness her dismembered remains. Yet her name echoes through history with a darkness that rivals any public execution. 4 centuries after her death, the blood Countess has become something far more powerful than any medieval noble who met their end on the executioner's block. She has become a myth that refuses to die. Within decades of her imprisonment, Elizabeth Bathory's story began to mutate beyond recognition. The testimonies of tortured servants, speaking of blood-soaked rituals and virgin sacrifices, became gospel truth in the collective imagination. By the 18th century, chroniclers were writing with absolute certainty about her bathing in the blood of 650 young women, as if they had witnessed these rituals themselves. The line between documented evidence and literary invention blurred until it disappeared entirely. But here lies the most disturbing aspect of Bathory's legacy. The enthusiastic embrace of her monstrosity by a culture that seemed to relish the idea of a woman capable of such exquisite cruelty. Unlike male tyrants whose brutality was contextualized within political necessity or warfare, Elizabeth's violence was distilled into something purely feminine and purely evil. Vanity taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. She became the perfect cautionary tale about women who sought power over life and death. Modern historians have begun to strip away centuries of accumulated legend, revealing a far more complex picture. The political motivations behind her downfall become impossible to ignore when examined closely. King Matthias needed to seize Bathory lands and wealth. The Hungarian nobility required a scapegoat for their own failures. The testimonies that condemned her came from servants tortured until they produced the desired confessions, a judicial process that would be considered worthless by any contemporary standard. Consider the mathematical impossibility of her alleged crimes. 650 victims over a period of roughly 15 years would require Elizabeth to murder someone every 8 or 9 days, consistently, for more than a decade. The logistics alone strain credibility. Where were the bodies? How did hundreds of families remain silent about their missing daughters? Why do contemporary records show so few formal complaints about disappearances in Bathory territories? Yet the myth persists precisely because it serves psychological needs that transcend historical accuracy. Elizabeth Bathory has become the archetypal female monster, embodying deep cultural anxieties about aging, beauty, power, and feminine sexuality. She appears in literature, film, and popular culture not as a complex historical figure, but as a symbol, the ultimate expression of vanity corrupted into evil. The true tragedy may be that Elizabeth Bathory, whatever her actual crimes, has been transformed into something she likely never was, a gleeful sadist who bathed in blood for cosmetic purposes. The real woman, widowed young, struggling to maintain vast estates in a violent era, possibly suffering from mental illness or epilepsy, has been erased in favor of a Gothic fantasy that tells us more about our own fears than about 16th century Hungary. Her legacy reveals how easily historical truth can be sacrificed to serve political convenience and cultural mythology. The Blood Countess lives on, not because she was history's most prolific female serial killer, but because we needed her to be. In condemning Elizabeth Bathory, we created a monster that says far more about us than it does about her. Even for a woman who once commanded castles and controlled the fates of hundreds, death comes quietly. Elizabeth Bathory spent her final years in a tomb of her own making, 3 small rooms in Countess castle, their windows bricked shut, their doors sealed from the outside. Food passed through a narrow slot. Waste removed the same way. The Countess, who had once bathed in luxury, now lived in conditions that would break most prisoners within weeks. The irony was devastating. A woman allegedly obsessed with preserving her youth through the blood of others was slowly withering away in darkness. Her skin, once pampered with the finest oils and treatments, grew pale and sallow. Her hair, which servants had once brushed for hours, became matted and gray. The hands that had supposedly wielded instruments of torture now trembled from malnutrition and the cold that seeped through stone walls. Yet Elizabeth's mind remained sharp, perhaps cruelly so. Contemporary accounts suggest she could be heard through the walls, sometimes speaking to invisible companions, other times reciting prayers in Latin. The woman who had lived surrounded by the screams of others now existed in a silence so complete that her own breathing became thunderous. Medical understanding of the time couldn't explain what we now recognize as the psychological effects of solitary confinement. The hallucinations, the disorientation, the gradual dissolution of the boundary between memory and reality. Her nephew, István Báthory, who had inherited much of her estate, visited occasionally. These encounters, described in surviving letters, paint a picture of a woman who somehow maintained her aristocratic bearing even in captivity. She never confessed. She never begged. She insisted until the end that she was the victim of a conspiracy designed to steal her lands and eliminate her power. Whether this was delusion or defiance, we'll never know. On August 21st, 1614, a guard delivering her morning meal found Elizabeth Bathory dead on the floor of her makeshift prison. She was 54 years old. No autopsy was performed. The family wanted the matter buried as quickly as possible. The official cause of death was listed simply as natural causes, but 4 years of total isolation had likely taken their toll on her heart, her lungs, her very will to live. The disposal of her body became immediately controversial. The local priest refused to allow her burial in the village cemetery, citing her reputation and the circumstances of her crimes. Her remains were initially interred at Countess castle itself, but even there she found no peace. Locals reported strange disturbances, unexplained sounds, and an atmosphere of dread around her grave. Whether driven by superstition or genuine unease, her family eventually moved her body to the Bathory family crypt in Exed, hundreds of miles away. But even this final resting place couldn't contain her legend. Stories persisted that her grave was disturbed again, that her remains were scattered to prevent her spirit from haunting the living. The exact location of Elizabeth Bathory's bones remains unknown to this day, a fitting end for a woman whose life had become so entangled with myth that separating reality from legend became impossible. In death, as in life, Elizabeth Bathory remained what she had always been. A figure too disturbing for society to simply forget, too complex for history to easily judge, and too human for us to dismiss as merely a monster. Her final days remind us that even legends must face the ultimate equalizer, mortality itself. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory's story reveals something deeply unsettling about how we construct our monsters. Here was a woman who wielded unprecedented power in a world that rarely granted it to her sex. who controlled vast estates and commanded armies, who negotiated with kings and shaped the political landscape of Eastern Europe. Yet what we remember isn't her diplomatic acumen or her military leadership. It's the image of her bathing in blood, a grotesque fairy tale that has overshadowed 4-century eras of historical inquiry. The truth is both simpler and more complex than the legend. The evidence suggests that Elizabeth likely did abuse her servants, perhaps even killed some in fits of rage or through systematic cruelty. The testimony of witnesses, even accounting for torture and political pressure, points to a woman who used her absolute authority to inflict suffering on those who had no recourse, no protection, no voice. But the numbers, the hundreds of victims, the industrial-scale murder, the ritualistic bathing in blood, these elements appear to be later embellishments, political propaganda designed to justify the seizure of her lands and the destruction of her family's power. What's most disturbing isn't just that she may have murdered servants, but that such murders were largely ignored until they became politically convenient. The Hungarian noble class had always treated their peasants as expendable. Elizabeth's real crime wasn't cruelty. It was being a woman with too much power at precisely the moment when powerful men decided they wanted what she had. The blood-bathing myth tells us more about our collective psychology than about Elizabeth herself. We've transformed her into a vampire centuries before Dracula, a witch who sought supernatural beauty through supernatural means. These stories satisfy something primal in us. Our fascination with the corruption of beauty, our anxiety about aging and mortality, our simultaneous attraction to and revulsion from absolute power. The real Elizabeth, a pragmatic politician who may have been both victim and perpetrator, is less cinematically satisfying than the blood countess who bathes in virgin blood. Her story persists because it crystallizes our deepest fears about power without accountability. In every age, we recognize the type, the person so insulated by wealth and status that they lose touch with basic human empathy, who begins to see other people as objects to be used and discarded. Whether it's a Renaissance countess or a modern oligarch, the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Power concentrated in the hands of someone who has never faced consequences for their actions. But perhaps the most chilling lesson of Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is how easily truth becomes myth, how quickly political convenience transforms into historical fact. The letters and legal documents that might tell us what really happened in those castle chambers have been buried under centuries of sensationalized retellings. We've chosen the monster over the woman, the legend over the history, the simple story over the complex reality. Today, as we grapple with our own powerful figures who seem to operate above the law, Elizabeth Bathory's story serves as a reminder that accountability, real accountability, is fragile. It requires institutions strong enough to challenge power, voices brave enough to speak truth, and societies willing to listen to the most vulnerable among us. The servant girls who died in Countess castle, whether they numbered in the dozens or the hundreds, deserved justice. Instead, they became footnotes in a political drama, their suffering transformed into entertainment for future generations. The blood countess will always be more compelling than the historical Elizabeth. But the historical Elizabeth, flawed, complex, ultimately human, has far more to teach us about the dangers we still face today.